Zach, we are back and we are talking moves to make to help rebuilding teams rebuild faster in 2024. So we get some moves we're going to discuss. We're going to talk rebuilding strictly today. But before we dive into it, I do hope that y'all enjoy the video. Please leave a like. If you do, comment down below what you're doing to try to rebuild your teams fast. And if you want that much more help rebuilding your teams, there's two great ways to do it. The first way is to head on over to patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in that Discord server for a free 7-day trial. Get 24/7 advice constantly on how to help rebuild that team. And then way number two, checking out the roster review option in the pinned comment below or the YouTube description box. Give in-depth advice on how to rebuild it, how to retool it, how to set you up to be competitive. Whatever the stretch is, we take an individualized look at what your roster is, your league settings, etc. But Zach, with all that said, all the promo in the book, so let's get to the content that people came for. Kicking it to you first. What is your first high impact move to make to help rebuilding teams rebuild faster in 2024? What do you got for us?
Yeah, I think the first thing that you have to do, and this really is going to flow really well into your point, Bob, is commit to the plan. It's really not easy to give up what could be 1 to 2 years. I think rebuilding can really be done in 1 year if you're very open to all the avenues of rebuilding, which at a certain point includes adding veteran players. So some people aren't, so it might take 2 years. But it's not easy to give up 1 to 2 years of a dynasty opportunity and of your money to rebuild a squad to make it more competitive, to have a better chance. But sometimes that allotted time to rebuild can really set you up to compete for the next 5+ years. I mean, I wanted to say 10 years, but we never know how things are going to go. But really what you need to do, Bob, is ask yourself if your squad can make a run at a title with some TLC during the season. And really what you don't want to be depending on is luck. And look, that's just a factor in fantasy football that nobody can account for, right? Whether you want to say that's 10%, 20%, 30% of winning a championship, luck is a factor. I'm a believer that skill is a bigger factor over luck, and luck does play a certain part of it, right? So yeah, look, luck's going to play a part of everyone winning a championship. But look at your squad and see, hey, if I give this a little attention during the season, if I play the waivers, if I make a trade, can I compete for a championship? And if not, it is very critical to start a rebuild right away. I'm a big believer, like, rebuilds don't start in January. That's a 1.5 year rebuild. Rebuilds start, if you want to do a 1-year rebuild, it has to start prior to the NFL season, whether that's June, whether that's May, whether that's September, whatever it is, you got to start doing it before, because really what you want to have control of is your own draft pick. Now, look, not having your draft pick is a whole nother scenario. That's a whole different conversation for another day, right? But everything starts at you getting 101 or 102. I mean, go back to the last few years and look at the impact players you've been able to draft at 101 and 102, and then the question marks that you can draft at 106. Okay. Let's just take it back to this last year's draft, right? The 106 area, Roma Dunze, who's a great talent, but lands in a situation where there's not quite the opportunity that you want right away. Brock Bowers, who lands in probably one of the worst landing spots that he could possibly have landed in. Then there's Drake May, who all reports right now are he's not having a good training camp. But 101, 102 is Caleb Williams, Marvin Harrison. You feel real good about those players, and you can do that for the last couple of years. You feel comfortable with your draft pick landing as early as you can to control the narrative of what happens in the rookie draft with your draft pick. I don't want to be in a scenario, Bob, where I want a player at 101 and 102, and I have to trade up for them. If I want that player, I want to be able to land them without giving anything up. So again, I know it's possible to rebuild once the season has started or once the season has ended, but it's easier to do that if you control your own draft pick at 101 and 102. For me, if I'm rebuilding, I am committing to it before the NFL season so I can ensure I am not scoring points on my roster. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And if it's time to rebuild, Bob, and here's another thing too. If you're unsure if it's time to rebuild, have a friend look at your roster. Have me or Bob look at your roster. We have a gold tier in our Patreon. We have roster reviews that you just pubbed a second ago. Have somebody, dude, I have a group of friends, and you're one of them, Bob, that when I'm unsure about something, I send a trade to, because you can give me an unequivocal, unbiased opinion on whatever it is I'm sending you. And sometimes you need that because you're just too emotional with whatever it is you're talking about. So have someone that can look at your squad and say, it's probably time to rebuild, or there's an opportunity to compete. Now, if it's time to rebuild, and before Bob gets this point in, another thing for me is knowing your strengths and weaknesses in terms of rebuilding. Are you good at drafting? Are you bad at trading for appropriate value? You need to know these things before you start the rebuild so you can kind of curtail the rebuild to whatever that is. So you need to know these things before the start so you don't end up in this scenario 3 to 4 years down the line again. A lot of people don't do a rebuild right, Bob, because they're bad at drafting or they're bad at trading for appropriate value. So those are the things to keep in mind when you start to commit to a rebuild, Bob.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack here, Zach. And I think just with the overarching theme of the point, committing to the plan, committing to the rebuild, you're investing cash capital, like you noted. You're investing into this dynasty league. You don't want to you want to make the most of what you're doing. You want to take the time to do it right, and that takes commitment to the plan, commitment to the process. And I think, you touched on the point of it's best to do it before the season. I think that can absolutely start after the season. It just depends how you take that process from January after the season, seeing, because that's when you're most likely to realize, like, man, this team needs an overhaul, this team needs a rebuild, whatever the case is, because a lot can happen over the course of the offseason where it's like, oh, now this guy's getting puff pieces, free agency upgraded some players on the roster or downgraded, whatever the case is. I think you can have a good idea that it's time to rebuild, and just talking about the process of how to rebuild in the offseason at that point, which we've discussed in plenty of videos before. But coming into that, realizing in January, but knowing what to do about that rebuild at that point, because yeah, you can't control your draft pick at that point. And in rookie drafts, when I'm rebuilding, I'm much more likely to try to trade down or trade out of a draft as opposed to trading up. I rarely, if ever, want to trade up. I don't know that a lot of the times the tier breaks are really all that worth it. Usually, what you have to pay to trade up. I've seen some trades go down in our Discord where they give up like a third round pick next year to move up a spot, and it's like a tier break between the spot. And maybe people don't understand that, whatever the case is, but if that's the case, absolutely move me up. But there's sometimes where it's to move up a couple spots as an extra first round pick. And if I'm in a rebuild, I'm not in a position to do that. I'm not going to go and sack a bunch of assets into one move or one pivot, whatever the case is. You get it. But especially to the point of knowing your strengths and weaknesses, knowing what you're good at, what you're not as good at, and then, taking charge of what you are good at, just doing that, working off draft capital, working off rookies, whatever the case is. If you're bad at finding appropriate values, check out your favorite content creators for talking values. Check out your favorite, if you're bad at drafting, check out who the best picks are from your favorite content creator, or check out rankings from wherever you want to find them. There's ways to supplement and go from there. Like you said, bouncing ideas off friends, anybody. That's what the Discord is great for as well. So I love this point, Zach. All in all, a solid start to getting into a rebuild. That kind of leads us right into my move to make here, which is take inventory of the roster you have. Set aside, you've decided to go into this rebuild. What is there to do with this roster? What can be done with this roster? This is one of the first things we do in our roster reviews. And this should be done at the start of any rebuild, whatever the case is. And if you're rebuilding and haven't done this in detail yet, I highly encourage you to take a step back and check this off of your to-do list. First question I'm asking myself is, do I have any core players worth building around now? Do I have anybody that I foresee outlasting the rebuild that's worth keeping on this roster? Or are there a bunch of high valued players that maybe don't outlast, or I could sell for a high price to jumpstart this rebuild, get a bunch of draft capital, get a bunch of other, picks and players is a rule I like to live by when I'm selling assets, to try to get a pick and a player, always chasing multiple assets in a rebuild as well when I'm selling. But sometimes it's hard to do, but it's worth selling some of your best pieces to try to give you the flexibility on how to proceed, jump starting the rebuild, getting a bunch of assets back, getting a haul back. Another category to break players down into: what players I need to sell now at peak value before their value falls even further. What teams have needs that I can help address? As a rebuilding team, your number one goal, as much as you want to turn yourself into a competitor at some point, your number one goal should be finding ways to help competitive teams win. And that's odd. That's a weird feeling. You want to help your league mates win. But the point is that while you help them win now, they're helping you win later. And a great thing to keep in mind right now with players, player value is going to be at peak value because players are scoring points. Points are what win championships. Picks are going to be a little more suppressed, so it's a little easier to sell those players 4 picks in the future. Another thing I'm looking at, what handcuff running backs do I have that I can look to sell at some point, either now if I can get good value selling them, whose rosters have those running back ones in relation to my handcuffs, and what can I sell them for now versus later? Can I get good value or not? Do I have to wait for that running back to be activated, for that running back one to go down with an injury to sell at max value? If that's the case, hey, wait, you're not, all you're doing by selling now is kind of maybe losing out on some value if you're not getting great value in return. But either which way, you have to be aggressive in a rebuild in terms of interacting and trying to get deals done. You have to knock on some doors. You have to be in people's faces, one of Zach's favorite things to do. And you have to facilitate deals by helping the teams who are trying to compete now get those players on their roster. Explore a means of obtaining value for every single player on your roster. Go through every player on your roster. What can you do with every player? Are they worth keeping? Are they more worth trading? And kind of proceed from there. Some guys might not hold a ton of value and they'll just be worth cutting. And there's value to that too, because you might be able to, depending on your league size, you might be able to add players off the waiver wire that are getting hype in camp that you can flip for literally anything. Turn your fab into draft capital. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but anything you can do with these players, take inventory, see what you can do with every single asset on your roster. Yeah, it'd be great to keep everyone and keep things rolling. And you got to start somewhere with your rebuild. Taking inventory is a good spot to do it with. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I always go back to one of my more successful rebuilds, and it's an orphan team that I took over, and I've won back-to-back championships in that league. The way that I rebuild, Bob, is I identify players that I want to build around. Like
Sure.
this whole thing, like every player can be bought. It's not true to me. Like if I don't want to sell a player, I don't care what you offer, because what you're offering to me is not worth the points that I plan on scoring with this player. Sure, the value is absolutely there sometimes in a trade, but when I'm taking over a team or when I'm entering a rebuild, I am taking inventory. I am looking at the players and saying, I don't really want to build around this guy. Like there's pretty much 3 boxes. Like, have to sell this guy, want to keep this guy, and kind of in the middle. But most players don't really fit that kind of in the middle. So what I'm trying to say here, Bob, is like when I do a rebuild, I take inventory of the players that I want to build around for the next 5 years. I wanted to build around in this league Tyreek Hill. This was 3 years ago that I made this decision. Tyreek Hill, who I inherited on the roster. Amon-Ra St. Brown, who I drafted in my first rookie draft. Chris Olave, who I drafted in my second rookie draft. TJ Hawkinson, who I traded for in my first year in that league. Like those were players that I wanted to build around. And for the most part, I never put them on the trade block. I was never interested in offers I received. Like, how do you view that? Because a lot of people view a rebuild like, I need to get this player to flip it for this. Like a good example is a Puka Nacua last year where, I hit on this 4th-round pick. I need to get a 1st-round pick. I am not like that. And you know that because we've come on the last 2 years when that player that sparks the dynasty community on fire 2 years, or last year it was Puka, 2 years ago it was Amon-Ra St. Brown. That dialogue starts to become, do I sell this player? And both times I've been starkly a no on that. So where do you stand on, like you said, taking inventory, but then deciding these players that you want to build around?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. What you're saying is kind of that fire sale mentality. Is that kind of what you're getting to, where you take
Well,
over a roster, you're rebuilding, you just want to sell everyone?
not necessarily. It's some people get lost in the rebuild and they stay in
Sure.
the rebuild because they've hit on draft picks and then they sell the draft picks. It's like, well, I'm
Sure.
getting another 1st round. Like, no, like at some point you have to score points. If
Yeah.
you're ever going to end the rebuild, you have to say to yourself, this is a great deal I'm getting. But is it worth more than the points that I'm going to get from this player in my lineup? And
Yeah.
for me, like I find so many people have that problem of saying, the rebuild is over. It's time to score points, and getting lost in that rebuild and maintaining that rebuild by not building around certain players.
Yeah. I think maybe one of the best tips to get people out of rebuilds faster is to not fall in love with the rebuild, because rebuilding is so much fun because you get to mold the roster in your vision, especially with orphan teams. Maybe it's your team that just hasn't panned out, whatever the case is, but you get to remold this roster in your vision. So it is a lot of fun. Don't get me wrong. But like you said, you need to turn the corner at some point. You need to stop the rebuild And I know that's one of the things you talk about is, especially towards the end of the rebuild, you make a staple buy that basically says that, kind of puts a league on notice, maybe a splash buy, maybe just something that is a little out of character where you buy a more competitive asset than what you had on your roster. But I'll touch on that too a little bit. But 100%, I think there's a fine line to cross or walk between having a player that is creating hype and is worth selling. Because the thing is like when you were looking at what Puka Nacua was doing and what Amon-Ra St. Brown were doing, and another player we'll talk about in another upcoming video, Kyron Williams has done. When you talk about certain players in certain levels of production, there are guys that are flash in the pans and put up some exciting numbers. They get this buzz. Those guys that there's a lot of other red flags on, more than happy to sell. But there are some guys where Puka Nacua was setting records. That doesn't just happen. That's not a fluke thing. You get it. Same with Amon-Ra St. Brown, wasn't setting records, but was getting a lot of attention, a lot of targets, and doing a lot with them. These guys are not flashes in the pan. So 100%, there comes a point where you need to, once you find a player, once you quote unquote hit on a player, there's somebody worth building around now. They don't have to be flipped. That's something that I think you can get into a lot of trouble with. Granted, how often does a Puka Nacua / Amon-Ra St. Brown happen? One each over the last handful of years. And I'm sure there's other examples too where players outperform their draft capital, their expectations, whatever the case is, and people want to flip them to quote unquote get out while they're getting still good before they fall off the face of the earth. But ultimately, I think it's a tough line to walk for sure. But I get what you're saying, Zach. But with that said, let's roll on into your next point here. Your next move to make for rebuilding teams to help them rebuild faster in 2024. What do you got?
When I'm in a rebuild, Bob, and I'm in the throes of the rebuild, I'm always on the lookout for what I call value guys, value buys throughout the season. These would be players that fit the rebuild timeline, but they also fit my plan of the current season to not really score points. Good examples of this in 2023. I'm sure there are more, but really good examples that really fit my a rebuilding timeline and a timeline of me not scoring points were Joe Burrow and Mark Andrews. There was a team, and I was on the competing end of this trade where I had Joe Burrows, and there was another team that was rebuilding, and they had C.J. Stroud, and we ended up making a trade where I acquired C.J. Stroud, and that team acquired Joe Burrow. I think it was I got C.J. Stroud in a second, they got Joe Burrow in a first. That kept me competitive. That kept them in the rebuild and still set them up with a young quarterback plus a first-round pick to maintain that rebuild. So it might not necessarily be like just buying these guys. It could be, flipping these guys, so on and so forth in situations that I just presented. But look, most rebuilds typically revolve around not winning in the current season. I don't want to speak for everyone, but I would imagine a rebuild at least takes one season of, hey, I kind of got to lose and not really win here so I get a better draft pick. For me, that's like the center point of my rebuild is my own draft pick. So like I said, be on the lookout for guys that throughout the season, they're not going to score points for you, and they might be hurting someone else. They might be dead weight on someone else's roster, somebody that's ultra competitive, and they're now at an opportunity to where they need to buy someone else that you have on your roster. And this is a player that you could really mold your rebuild around. Mark Andrews everyone thinks Mark Andrews is old. He's like 28. Joe Burrow is just starting his second contract. So these are still young guys that you can mold a rebuild around. Not every player in a rebuild needs to be 23 years old. Like Mark Andrews is a really solid piece that I feel comfortable for the next 5 years, as long as he's healthy, giving me the same kind of production that he's had before. So obviously this is something that I'm very well known for in our Dynasty Rewind community. People that are in leagues with me, depending on what the situation is, always hit me up if there's an injury to a player, or I have an injury to a player, or I want to buy an injury, a player that has an injury. So this really is one of the staples of my rebuild because it helps me advance that rebuild so much. So not everything is going to be you drafting players, finding waiver. You got to take risks. And a lot of another good one was Tank Dell last year. I forgot to put Tank Dell on this list. Young player, really showed out last year. And for people that needed points that were relying on Tank Dell last year, because when he was scoring, he was top 10 last year as a wide receiver. That's a player that you could have bought in the throes of the regular season where somebody needed to move off and pivot off some points. So, we obviously, very well, Bob, I'm big on buying injured players. It's something that a lot of people that watch the videos or people in leagues with me know about me. It's really something I want to capitalize on to kind of catapult my rebuild, because I really don't look for my rebuilds, Bob, to take more than 1 year. If I really got to strip it down to the bare bones, 2 years, but I would like to be like, I'm paying for these leagues. I would like to be competitive. It takes skill to make the playoffs and a little bit of luck to win your fantasy championship. So I want to get to the playoffs after 1 year of rebuilding for the most part. And buying injured players is something that really helps me from 1 year to the next, from 1 year to not score points to the next year to be a competitive team.
Because like you said, these are guys that you're acquiring at pretty awesome costs. At least last year you were when they were injured. And once a competitive team loses these types of assets, they need to fill that gap, or they need to decide to rebuild themselves. One of those decisions you could help them make by coming to them and being like, hey, I have this quarterback who's still young and good. Especially CJ Stroud for Joe Burrow, like getting that done with moving CJ Stroud in a second for Joe Burrow in a first, even if that first is a later one because you're sending the competitive asset. Man, that still feels like a good deal, because I don't think Joe Burrow and CJ Stroud are honestly that far apart. I know Joe Burrow has had some injury question marks and things of that sort, but man, that feels like a good buy. But either way, adding these players that can be staples for you, be core players for you for the long run, it's like ticking a box. You have this, you need to fill a lineup, at least a good chunk of a lineup with quote unquote core players you're going to continuously build around. And then what you can do, and I'll touch on this a little later, is just buy cheaper vets that are undervalued, because players, oh, this guy's going to fall off a cliff. This guy's old now in Dynasty. And maybe in a couple years, we've pivoted off of that and we're not devaluing players so quickly in their careers when they're still putting up production. But either which way, I like this point a good bit, Zach, and it kind of flows in with a couple of my next points. But moving on to mine here, a move to make that I always do, and this could go without saying, but either way, I prioritize quarterbacks, wide receivers, and tight ends, and very heavily deprioritize running back, because A, I could probably draft a running back a heck of a lot cheaper when the time comes that I need one, and B, every year, the last several years that we've been doing this, there has been cheap, productive running backs available for second, maybe a pair of third-round picks that you can add to fill out a lineup. So if I can just set up my quarterback, set up my wide receiver, set up my tight end, and then just play money ball at running back, maybe I draft one running back to have as my quote-unquote crown jewel to build around. Great. That's kind of what I'm looking to do. So, and the reason being is it's no secret that quarterbacks, wide receivers, and tight ends just have a longer shelf life than running backs. So why wouldn't you build around them in a rebuild? In a rebuild, it's important to invest whatever assets you have in a position that will outlast the rebuild and hopefully maintain or even ideally increase in value. Quarterbacks, wide receivers, tight ends have a funny way of doing that. Running backs, I'd almost argue that most of them trend down from the second they're drafted, unless they're, later round hits like a Kyron Williams, like we've talked about, mid-round picks like Devon Achane, although I think he was pretty highly valued even before he touched the football field, but either which way. And as far as I go, when I deprioritize running back, when I'm rebuilding, I'm as zero running back as it gets. I don't need a starting running back. I know, Zach, for the sake of the game, you like to have some running back in there, but if I have Trey Sermon in my lineup, I'm not upset about it. If I have two Trey Sermons who are doing 1 to 2 points a week, I'm good. I'm stoked that my running backs aren't doing anything points wise for me. So most of my running backs, if I have them on my roster, they're mostly upside players, handcuffs, etc., that I'm more likely just hoping to flip for more than what I paid to get them. If anything, fab, whatever the case is, if I can get some draft capital back that I'll later flip, I'll talk about that a little later. But for now, running back is the ugly stepchild of my roster that will be sorted out a lot later. So what I like to do in this case of prioritizing quarterbacks, wide receivers, tight ends, kind of talking like you just did, look for advantageous situations where you can buy lower than you should be able to, even if it's a more expensive price tag than free, low, you're buying lower than you should be able to. And these aren't guys that are necessarily injured. One of them is, but at quarterback, I like taking a look at Justin Herbert. Do I think he's in for a stellar season? No, I do not. But I think in the long term, Justin Herbert will still be a top 12 producer that you might be able to get right now for significantly cheaper than that, especially once we get into the season. I currently have the Chargers as the run heaviest team by percentage for this season, looking at my 2024 projections. If you want those, Gold tier patrons have access to that, or you could buy it through Patreon. At tight end, I love taking my shot with TJ Hawkinson, another guy who's probably not destined for a great 2024. But again, this boils into your point where I don't need them to be good in 2024. I need them to be good in 2025 and beyond. But this is due to his quarterback situation, bouncing back from an ACL injury. The team has invested highly in him, and I expect him to get back on track in 2025. As for wide receivers right now, I don't see any screaming buys for a rebuilding team, but I'm going to keep my eyes on players who I believe could have rough seasons where their managers might lower on them and be willing to sell cheaper later, or at least at a more accessible cost. Someone like Malik Neighbors comes to mind, and maybe this is hopium for myself that somebody would be willing to sell me Malik Neighbors at a cheaper cost later so I can finally get myself a share. Yes, he'll still be expensive, but does he become more accessible if he doesn't meet the expectations that go along with a top 10 Dynasty wide receiver price tag? That's where he's valued right now. I don't see him producing close to that this season. The big caveat here is when I'm rebuilding, and I've kind of mentioned this before, I don't want to dump all my assets into one player. I'd much rather, I call this the accordion concept, where I spread everything out, diversify, get plus assets as much as I can, and then it consolidates back into other players, assets, proven commodities, whatever the case is. And to further tease a later segment, if you can establish a solid core group of players, I've touched on this before, and build up a respectable pool of assets, you can definitely fill the rest of your roster gaps with discounted bets and compete sooner than you may think. But we need that core group to work around first, because otherwise, I don't think you can do Moneyball with you could try to do a Moneyball with an aging, undervalued roster. That'd probably be fun to maybe do a video on, but I don't know if I'd want to do that personally. I want to keep my core intact either way. But Zach, feel free to touch on this point before we roll into the next one.
Yeah, I mean that you're talking about the building blocks of a dynasty team, right? I mean this could apply to so much more than just a rebuilding video, because
Sure,
really, newsflash, running backs suck. Running backs suck for fantasy.
very volatile.
Yeah, exactly. And
They're good for points, but they're tough for their value ebbs and flows so much that they're, like you said, you said running backs suck. They suck to have and to hold. I just wanted to clarify before people think running backs aren't important.
This makes me think of the team that I was just talking about a few minutes ago that I took over as an orphan, and then I've won 2 championships in a row. A couple things that I did on that roster was, obviously we talked about the wide receivers I had: Tyreek Hill, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Chris Olave, TJ Hawkinson. Running backs were not a priority. They were not a priority. My running backs to start last year was Brian Robinson and Aaron Jones. And then I know you remember this. But we talked, my point just previously, buying the injured players, I ended up trading Aaron Jones and Brock Purdy to the 1 quarterback league for Kyron Williams. I mean, that worked out for me pretty well. So the 0 RB strategy and then buying an injured player when he was injured. So look, you're talking about the building blocks of what every dynasty should be. Is wide receiver. To me, you can put quarterback and tight. It's wide receiver. It's wide receiver. It's wide receiver. It's wide receiver. And another, by the way, wide receiver that you could talk about last year as a buy that was a rookie that disappointed was JSN. Right, JSN. Everyone was so disappointed with JSN, which, I mean, I wasn't, because it was everything I expected. That's why I wasn't drafting JSN. I had no shares of JSN at the end of rookie drafts. I probably had 2 to 3 at the end, and I'm in 30 leagues at the end of the season. So because I bought those opportunities to buy lower on JSN because other teams were. I mean, you remember the values of JSN early in the offseason, January, February, and some of the videos we were doing. So I think Malik Neighbors qualifies for that, and I think Rome Odunze does if he's not a top option wide receiver.
Sure, I agree. I don't know if I like JSN as much right now, because I think his value's climbed up a good bit. But I agree with the sentiment of somebody.
But what it was last year is what you were talking about. Yeah,
I agree. We will roll along into your next point here. This is a good one. This is, I mean, one of the catalysts to rebuilding is right here, right now.
Yeah, this is a 2 for a point. The first point is understanding when to move veteran players, and the second point is, at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you don't have assets expire on your roster. It doesn't hurt you if these assets expire on your roster. Not necessarily. It just doesn't help you as much as it could. So let me explain, right? Just because you're in a rebuild, Bob, it doesn't mean that it all needs to happen right away, right? And again, I'm approaching a rebuild from this point of the season. Like this video is dropping first week of August. That's when I like to do my rebuilds. I don't like to do my rebuilds in January. I don't like to do my rebuilds in April. I like to do them before the season because, again, I want to control my draft pick outcome. So not everything needs to happen right away. We don't necessarily want to win or score points, right? But we don't want to give away players for less than the value that they're supposed to have. What you can do here, and again, I'm talking about more veteran players here. I think younger players will retain their value no matter what time of the year, but that's just something that happens in the offseason where points aren't sexy amongst the Dynasty community. It is what it is. I think that's just always going to be the way it is. What you could do is you could wait for what we call a boom week when a player really outperforms, and there will be some of those players in week one that will score a ton of points, and these veteran teams or these teams that are trying to compete will want to buy that veteran player. Then you post that player in the trade block, right? But a lot of Dynasty players, they have a low perceived value of veterans at this point in the offseason. Even when we're at preseason games, your fantasy team is still not scoring points. And veteran players are not as desirable as when they start scoring points. I think a great example of this, and I'll talk about a couple more, is like Alvin Kamara, right? Alvin Kamara's off-season value is always so low. And even I was on that train last year. I'm like, this guy, Kendrick Miller, blah, blah, blah. I mean, like, the situation is what it is. Like, we cannot turn a blind eye to what is actually happening. And Alvin Kamara is hyper productive, even though he's not efficient. Derek Carr loves the outlet look or the throw it to the flat look, and that's going to be Alvin Kamara every time. And so, look, there's a couple other examples: Mike Evans, Derrick Henry, and I would even put Dak Prescott in that category because nobody was buying Dak Prescott at the start of last season as to what they were doing at week 10 last year when he was on an MVP level pace. And so there's no reason why Dak Prescott can't come into this season and do kind of the same thing and be an all pro quarterback, so to say. Once it's point scoring season, then some of these other teams in your leagues, Bob, are going to start to inquire about these veteran players. So again, you don't have to move veteran players right away. Yes, you have a perceived fire sale, absolutely, but make sure that you're getting appropriate value. I've gotten some incredibly ridiculous offers as a competing team for players that I've accepted because they were just too good. I can't lift them off the top of my head, but I want to make sure that we are advocating that people don't do that. Don't just try to get these points off your roster. Be systematic about it. Have a game plan for this. Getting rid of older players. It doesn't have to be before week 1. Yes, we don't want to score points, but you have 14 weeks to do that. You don't have to do it all in week 1. So if you have some of these veteran players and you're not able to move them now for what you think is appropriate value, make sure that you're asking for appropriate value. Don't be ridiculous with some of these players. You can wait. You can wait till weeks 2, weeks 3. The only drawback to that is if those players get injured. Sure. Now you're in a pickle. Because you're either accepting less than what they're worth or you're hoping that they come back healthy. I mean, look at Aaron Jones last year, right? Had a phenomenal week 1, then didn't come back for 6 weeks, then kind of came back, then didn't come back, then he was out, then he was in, then he was great down the stretch. But you don't want to be stuck with that kind of a situation on your hands. So you really have to think this part through in terms of your rebuild and when you want to move some of these players. But for me, I really don't want players to expire on my roster as the point so beautifully lays out. I want to make sure that I'm moving them off so that I can get some kind of value at some point. I really don't want to be moving into the offseason with some of these players. And unfortunately, that might happen here and there. You have to be really careful. You have to know your league. Are teams eager during the season? Is it not really a very active league with trades? Well, you got to know that. If you get an offer and it's not everything that you want, but you know that this league doesn't really trade a whole lot, then maybe you do need to pull the trigger on that offer. So it's a very there's no black and white rule about this. This is kind of a gray area, but you want to make sure this is something that you are, I don't want to say you perfect, but that you understand how to pull off accurately, because it will propel your rebuild really well into the offseason, which we want to be moving into the offseason with exactly what Bob is going to talk about next.
Yeah, in a second, but I have to talk about yours first. One saying that I love in general, but I think really reigns true in this concept of trying to toe that line between wanting to get just the right amount of value, not getting any value, or selling too light. Keep in mind, pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. And when you're trying to ask for too much, you're just not going to get it. And when you're selling too low, you're not getting proper value. Like you said, what I want to do and my system for wanting to sell on these players, these positional groupings, whatever the case is, what's funny with older players and veterans, how they age, how they produce, and things like that, is their value tends to drop off before their production does. So their production hangs around for a couple years after their value ticks off. And looking into this just at a broad glance, I have not done a deep dive on this. I want to. That's something I'll probably look into hopefully sometime this season, maybe next off season. Is quarterbacks probably drop off in value around age 32, but they can produce up to age 40. Maybe not age 40. That might be a little aggressive, factoring in a few outliers. But running backs value probably starts to dwindle after the age of 26, unless you're Christian McCaffrey. Wide receivers probably after the age of 28, tight ends after the age of 31, 32. So I want to sell on those players, those position groupings before that value drops out. And the best way to do that might be, and you're adding risk, like you said, with this, Zach, and hopefully your team isn't full of veterans. Maybe you just have a couple you're waiting around to kind of sell to the right team at the right cost. Selling these guys at close to your trade deadline, if you have one, or close to the quote unquote, what I like to call the arms race, in the middle of the season when, the competitive teams are all just making those quote unquote all in pushes, enough quote unquote for this video, at least this segment. They're trying to make these all in pushes and they're willing to spend probably more than they should. If you can hold some of those players, that's probably the best time to sell them, because once they hit the offseason, it's another offseason of uncertainty. Every quote unquote old player, dang it, is dead to everybody. Their value is, at least. So maybe trying to hold them until we get to that arms race point of the season, selling them then while they're still a year younger. I didn't say it that time, but I definitely did the quoties. Might be the best process. And you said too, you don't want to have all these points on your team. If you don't have a ton of these veterans, it's not going to make a huge impact. If you have one or two veterans putting up a good chunk of points on your roster, it's not going to make a huge deal if the rest of your roster is young players, mostly invested in draft capital, whatever the case is. That's the nice thing about investing in draft capital. Draft capital doesn't score your points right now. And when you're a rebuilding team, you don't want points. Points are not something you want. You want to get that higher pick, because that improves the value of your pick by doing nothing. That's one of the greatest ways to, it's kind of like an investment of, you just put that pick in the bank, you let it sit all year, you don't score points. Your pick is really good the next year, and it's worth more than 106 or 107 might have been if you were a mid-tier team. But moving on to the last point here, and one of my biggest notes, and one of my in any roster build, but especially in rebuilds, I'm aiming to build up my asset pool. Go back to the accordion. We're going to spread it out and then consolidate it back together when we're ready to kind of turn around, once we have our core pieces in mind, whatever the case is. But we want to rebuild quickly, but rebuilds are a marathon and not a sprint, and we need ammo for the war ahead. Something I love to do at the start of any rebuild is build up a war chest of draft capital and player assets if I can. Getting players back in deals that have a proven track record, that have proven to be worthwhile, also show some upside, can help expedite your rebuild, since it's one less year or X less years that player has been in the league that you have to wait for a player to reach peak production. But I'm not just looking to get these picks on my roster to draft rookies with them. In fact, I think that'd be a bit of a selling short on the true value of rookie picks, using picks to their full level of value. As much as we can believe in X prospect, whether it's because we watch 18 hours of film on a player, or we believe in this super flashy analytic, yards per route run, whatever the case is, yards after the catch per reception, whatever. But selling those picks that could be rookie busts for proven commodities can help you rebuild much faster, because you're not waiting on rookie to reach peak production, and you already know you have a proven worthwhile asset that can be factored into your long-term starting lineup. These proven pieces don't have to be players in their prime, but they can be. It depends on what picks you're selling, what they should kind of go towards. So let's kind of combine points here, points 1 and 2 at least. Find the right players and positions to build around. Start with there, then build up your draft capital, and then draft with some of the players. One thing I would really like to do with my early first round picks, if I'm in a rebuild and it looks like it's maybe going to be a 2-year rebuild versus a 1-year turnaround, take that first pick, that 101 or that 102, and sink the pick. That's one of my favorite things to do. Trade down a couple times in the first round, get a first round pick on top of next year. So we talked about earlier, it costs a lot to jump through tiers in a rookie draft for a lot of teams, a lot of leagues, and then trade to the 01, whatever that is, or the 02, whatever the first pick is. If you have the 01, obviously you can't trade with yourself unless you traded that pick away at some point. But hey, you could do that too. Trade into that 201, then trade that 201 for another first next year, load up next year's draft, and then trade all those picks for elite or more elite assets. So with picks, sell high first for elite assets, sell seconds to fill out your rosters with proven veterans that may be aged, undervalued, the Mike Evans, Alvin Kamara's, Derrick Henry's of the world that can help just fill things out, help you through a season while your core group of players is still playing kind of not necessarily catch up, but you're invested heavily into several positions, fill out the rest with second round picks, etc. You get it. And that's the kind of way to do it a little faster, as opposed to you don't need to get your lineup full of 9 Jamar Chases. You don't need to do that. It'd be awesome to have 9 Jamar Chase level assets in your starting lineup, but you don't realistically need to do that. And even if you tried, because honestly, as much as I like Marvin Harrison this year, Marvin Harrison's a top 5 valued wide receiver now, which too high for me, but that's not what we're talking about today. 9 Marvin Harrisons right now, probably not going to win you a championship. Even as much as we'd love to see it happen for Marvin Harrison this year to pop off year one. The sexy paper roster full of young talents, you talked about this earlier, Zach, of 23, 22, 24-year-olds even, usually not going to win you a championship, which is what we want to do here. We want to build up assets. There's several ways to do that. Selling players at peak value in season or in preseason that no longer fit your team's trajectory. These are the old players, etc. We talked about this. One of my favorite things to do right now, adding in an extra pick to any deal you're working on if it's close, even if it's just a third-round pick to just get that added in. But one thing I really love doing right now is including a distant third for a 25 second or a next year second. Apply this to any year. For example, I'm including my 26th third-round pick for a 25 second to add more value to a current deal I'm working on. You get an earlier year, you get to use that pick sooner, you get an earlier pick, and the sooner that pick hits its peak value and can be utilized. Love that concept. Making tier down trades to add draft capital, always about that. Adding players off waivers to flip them for anything when hype hits. Turn that fab of yours into draft capital. That's the most valuable thing you can do with it, in my opinion. You're not going to find long-term consistent starters on most waiver wires, and then holding handcuffs to flip when they're activated. Those are just a couple ways to build up assets in a rebuild. Zach, why don't you finish this one out? What else you got here?
I mean, it's hard to add on top of this as much as it is just to put a bow on all this. And look, again, I think the most important thing is you do not want to draft a bunch of players if you have a bunch of draft capital. That is a way to lose a lot of value real quick. And sometimes what that even means is it doesn't even necessarily mean you have to trade for players. Just trade for more future picks. Roll that pick down the line a little bit. There was a league that I was in last year. I had to pull it up here to take a look at it, where I had, I think, 6 or 7 first-round picks. I ended up turning a couple of those into Jaden Reed, Kyron Williams. I only ended up drafting with 3 of the first-round picks, and I have 3 first-round picks in 2025. So that's probably a slower rebuild for me. This is a little bit more of a shallower roster league, so I want to get kind of those big pieces as much as not so much it's not a start 11, start 12. This is a start 9. So you want to have a little bit more high-end pieces on this roster. But, just like you said, I love building up a war chest of draft capital. And I love spending a war chest of draft capital on not only rookies. I'm a big fan of making sure I'm buying some players in the offseason to expedite the rebuild. And just like you said, kind of put that stamp on, this rebuild is over. We are here to commit. We are here to finally compete. And that'll also send, signals to your league mates like, oh, I haven't been sending him this offer because it's for Cooper Kupp or it's Mike Evans and he's been rebuilding. Now maybe he's interested in some of these players. So this is a great point. I can't add anything onto it. You really did cover everything. So I'm just trying to put a nice little bow on it for you.
Yeah, and I think adding on to the point real quick of not using all your draft capital, I've worked on rebuilds or roster reviews that have 15 picks in 1 year, and I'm like, we don't we do not need that unless we have nobody on the roster. We don't need 15 picks, so continue rolling that over. And another way to expedite the rebuild and help yourself out is to put draft capital on the back end, the back year of when you're competing. So if you're looking to compete in 2025, loading up on 26 draft capital to then use in the 2025 season to buy players as teams fall out, turn into sellers, as teams fall off of their competitive wagon, buying in on the Mike Evans of that year, et cetera. We always throw out Mike Evans as an example, but it's always a good one. So having that draft capital on the back of when you're aiming to turn it around is a huge move too. It gives you more in your war chest for that season to make moves during the season, and any other additional roster moves that you need to make that come up during the season, you have something to play with that can get players on your roster to put points in your lineup. But while that is it for this one today, we do hope that y'all enjoyed. Please leave a like if you did. Comment down below what you were trying to do as a rebuilding team to help you rebuild faster in 2024. We hope to see you in our Discord, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in there for a free 7-day trial and see what we can do for your fantasy teams, as well as checking out the YouTube description box and the pinned comment below to check out the roster view option. But that is going to be it for this one. We're going to head out of here. We will see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one.